Okay, I believe we are live. So, hi everybody. It's a pleasure being with you again.
We are live. So, hi.
I think, Karsten, you have your audio on there for the video, so it's echoing a little bit. Yeah, good. Thanks. Yeah, my one is also on here, so sorry for that. Let me just turn it off. Okay, great. So here we are again for another conversation. Since our last meeting, we had some feedbacks and about how it was and suggestions. So we discussed about it, and I hope we will incorporate most of them or all of them. And so today, what we will discuss is good and bad practices on tourism. And for that, I will directly pass the word to Karsten. And after his speech, we'll be opening for questions and answers. So if you have any question, please write down on the chat by your side here. I think you can all see it. If you can't, you can send us an email, and I'll reach it, and I can read it for Karsten. So yeah, we can do it like this. Okay, so Karsten, thank you again for your availability to be here again, and go ahead.
Thank you, Peter, from Malta to Brazil, connecting the world. Today, yes, after our first session, today we said we'll also keep it a bit shorter, a bit more to the point, to focus on what maybe could be some good and bad practices in tourism, always in relation to culture and heritage, which both of us work in, and maybe even people following us may be more interested in. It's interesting talking about good and bad practice because some people in education focus on good practice, rightly so, because they say that maybe you can't really learn much from bad practice. You should focus on what is good and not focus on mistakes. I tend to believe that you can learn a lot from what is not so good. Maybe as well from a pessimistic perspective, from a critical perspective, one may argue there is more bad practice than good practice. Like there is more bad design than good design. There is more non-planning than good planning. And one can learn from the abundance of negative, bad practice around us in order to try to turn it around and learn from mistakes. Sometimes bad practice isn't something purposeful that someone or a group or an organization or a whole community wants to do on purpose, to do bad, but it's maybe through circumstance, lack of resources, lack of time, conflicting priorities. In tourism, for example, how do you manage a site which maybe can bring in a lot of money in the short term, because you can commercialize historical sites, but at the same time maybe losing touch with the long term. Also, what do you describe and what do you define as good and best practice? And without wanting to be too theoretical, people within the field of cultural tourism, like Ducros and McKercher, who recently reissued the second edition of their cultural tourism studies, spend a lot of time on the definition without being boring, without being dry, because they remind us that you define things depending on how you see them, and how you see things depends on where you stand. And where you stand also depends on where others are standing in relation to you. So, to make things more interesting, exciting, but also more complicated, best practice and good practice sometimes are relative. what is maybe a good practice for you is not so good for me, and vice versa. And I guess this also brings to the discussion, how can we learn? Is there one standard way of learning? Absolutely not. Some people believe that. I think many others don't, and I also don't believe that. So it does create a complication, because if you are maybe speaking to experts or people who know a lot about their field, sometimes small countries like my own Malta rely a little bit maybe too much on consultancies, internally or externally. And today I was having, in fact, this conversation with a colleague of mine at the University of Malta on what one would do when one is faced by a consultant or by an expert. Because sometimes we tend to rely a lot on the expert, on the consultant, without doing our homework. It doesn't mean that I know it all, or that you know it all, or that we should not seek good practice examples and models in order to try to learn from them. But I think it's not enough. We need to raise our game. We need to do a lot of research into what is our experience in order to then learn what we can and also challenge back other practices. So if maybe, to give an example, UNESCO or ICROM or other international respected organizations develop a list of standards of what one should do to practice sustainable cultural tourism, creative tourism, heritage protection, intangible or tangible, all of that. We also have to keep in mind that these same people, these same organizations, do not write, so to speak, the 10 Commandments in stone, to use Judeo-Christian religious image, and then stick to them. They revise, they change, they learn, they consult again amongst themselves, because things change. And maybe one of the main things, not to sound too absolutist, but one of the main things we have to learn from as human beings is the environment around us that changes because of actions by the human being, but also because of the way nature evolves and changes. So one thing I keep in mind a lot is the Mediterranean, which is where I come from, as a region, has been written a lot about from the time of Homer to the time of Brodel and recent Mediterraneanists who keep revising and studying with archaeology and everything. And last time I mentioned the Phoenicians' route as a best practice of cultural tourism in the Council of Europe, for example. But somehow we need to keep in mind that the Mediterranean itself is always changing, climatically, environmentally, politically, because of the environment, like water scarcity, resources which are getting becoming hotspots and conflictual. And also keeping in mind that because of the Great Rift on the eastern side of Africa, which is opening up in a number of years, thousands, millions, the Mediterranean will be split open. There will not be the Mediterranean as you know it. So even issues which today are so important will have to be totally revised in a number of years, even if it's thousands or millions. But I think it's very sobering to think that the human being is one element in his or her world. We do not control everything, and somehow it's really good to keep on our toes and keep learning.
Great.
What do you think about that, Peter?
Thank you, Karsten. I was just reactivating my microphone. Sorry. Yeah, it's great. While you were thinking, I was thinking here. We have entitled this conversation on good and bad practices, right? And you started really well putting it into perspective, because is that a moral or an ethical issue, right? So many times when we start saying about good and bad, we mostly think on moral or cultural, let's put it like that, references. right? Like the way you said, what is good for me might not be good for you. Anyway, I was thinking that I was thinking about the Human Rights Declaration, for example. We have this paper, right, which is thought to be something that could be helpful for anybody. That's what I believe is its purpose, right? To really help any nation, any person, any human being. So being a bit provocative in the sense of going deeper on this discussion, do you think it would make sense, for example, to have a ethical tourism declaration? And if we had something like this, what should be in it? I mean, how would be the process to develop a text like this, so that maybe this can help us thinking on, okay, what is ethical on all that and what is moral on all that? Meaning, are there things that lies connected to everybody?
Yes. I think that's a really crucial question, Gata, because in a way, I also feel as an individual, the burden of trying to define good and bad, as you said, in the context of being Maltese, Mediterranean, European, white, male. How does the definition come from? How does it develop? It is biased, and there are certain things I think which don't apply to others, and it definitely has happened over time. You mentioned I will be sharing some images, because when we say, can you see this, Greta, so that even our followers can see this?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
So this is done. This is done. So your theoretical question is answered in practice, because, for example, UNESCO, with its own set of ideas, also related to the Sustainable Development Goals, which we discussed also in the last discussion we had. Also, for example, with regard to other documents, which are very close to us, because we have worked closely with the Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Cultural Expressions, for example, in terms of identity. And there are documents, and there are a lot of exercises, even in terms of this ethic-moral dilemma sometimes, of what is the way to promote actions and activities in culture and tourism. And sometimes issues can be very, very challenging. What happens in Latin America, in South America, or in Africa, where you've got challenges between what is not allowed, frowned upon by certain important parts of the community, even the international community, when it comes to, for example, not allowing certain behavior, for example, poaching of animals or cutting down of trees in desertified areas, which, however, is the only way that certain people feel or believe through experience and through practice that they can survive. So in that conflict between certain perspectives on what is good and bad and the everyday practice being practiced by others who may not be in, let's call it, a privileged position to decide that, no, we should not kill these animals. No, we should not cut these trees for charcoal to make cheap fuel out of. But it is very much dependent on the experience of people in that very particular tricky situation. It's easy for me to say, oh yes, one should do this and one should do that. But when people's survival is the case, is the matter, even in terms of what they can get out of the product and the service which is tourism, you enter into a very big irony, which is if a site, a venue, a beach, the food of a place, the environment, the natural environment of a place, or the religious maybe experience which belongs to a place, if that is a source of livelihood, income, humanity, respect, decency, because a community is making a living, is making money out of that experience, who can decide and say, no, you should not do this anymore because it pollutes, because it's killing the environment, because you're damaging yourself? So very valid arguments, and long-term and sustainable, as they are enshrined in what we have been referring to, for example, UNESCO or ICROM or other international organizations. But in a way, the good practice standard guideline list of what to do, like the ethic moral standards you rightly talked about, then have to be tested. And the testing comes through the resources and the tools. So are the organizations, are the authorities promoting certain sustainable behavior, for example, also allowing the different communities engaging with a site, with a place, with a venue, with a source of income, the tools, the means to respect those guidelines? Or are they just being told, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to stay off this place, you cannot do this type of income generation, you cannot kill your own nature, but then they're not given alternative means, or they're not protected by law maybe, in order to protect what they are being told to protect in the first place. And you being from South America, and many examples in tourism come from there, because it's not good enough to say, this is the way we should do things. Yes, but what are the alternatives, and how do you practice them?
Interesting. So what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there isn't such a thing as a established good or bad practice on tourism, but you really have to look at it in perspective, considering the context, the culture, the values, the ideas of a certain location, for example.
Well, I think the answer is yes and no, because in actual fact, practices do exist. So together with what we were seeing before, with a lot of examples of conferences, of best practice networks, of validation processes, of trying to keep the balance between urban development, for example, and environmental sustainability in line with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Together with that, you've got even a quick Google search of good practice, for example, brings up lists and lists of tangible and intangible documents, which are guidelines, recommendations, more policy and strategy than legal documents, because somehow culture, tourism, heritage are caught in the dilemma between economic prioritization and then what is done on the ground, on the territory. For example, in the European Union, which Malta is a member of, we've got the sustainability principle. We've got the sustainability principle, but we've also got the principle which allows respect for member states to practice their own national priorities. So without having another super body interfere into that. However, there are other also ways of trying to instill principles when it comes to culture, heritage, and tourism in the practice, for example, of professionals who may work in the different fields, which at the most can encourage, can try to make it easier, and also by protecting, in certain cases, even through legal, national legal tools, which allows certain practitioners of the field to be defended in what, at the end of the day, they are trying to promote and what they are trying to fight against sometimes in order to instill the good practice and maintain it. So the answer will be a mixed one again, a very complicated issue today, because it's, yes, there are rules, there are guidelines, but then the practices change. So you can't really have a blanket of this can work everywhere or this should work everywhere. And also time makes a difference, because certain times then you need to revise depending on whether a site maybe is being too protected and ironically maybe cut off from the community itself, which somehow would maybe feel a bit more comfortable closer to the site. A number of experiences recently came to mind thinking about this topic, be it the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and how people relate to it, and maybe what for some people can be too casual, too close, even physically, even tangibly, to certain stones, what you can climb, what you can't climb, what you can dive into, how you can relate to the environment. Same thing, for example, recently I was in Byblos in Lebanon. And it was strange from a European perspective to see children during a school outing just clamber on the ruins of the Phoenician route there. But then I stopped to think and said, but this is their heritage. Yes, it is World Heritage, but it's also theirs in a human way. If people are told not to touch, not to interact with, so I know it may sound blasphemous, but not to have their family gathering, which might include food, for example, or drink, within a historical site. You're protecting the site, but are you desensitizing it? Are you sanitizing it to such a level, to such an extent, that you're somehow making it too, I'm going to use a funny expression, too much like a museum? When maybe even museums shouldn't be like that, especially today when they're all encouraging touch and children to interact and taking something home so I think the balance changes. It always changes.
So in this sense, would you say that actually it's not that there isn't a good or a bad practice itself, but what might be needed and what could really be a key to have good and bad, good practices implemented would be a local participation and also a global participation, meaning to really understand the needs and the culture from the site for itself, but not forgetting the global view on it.
Yeah. Yes, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, because the local element of who are the local communities brings to mind. I wonder whether you can see this. I'll just keep it on for a few seconds. The Butler model, an old, traditional, classic model of tourism life cycle, for example. How tourism can grow until either it stops and starts dying off, or else somehow it needs to be rethought and regenerated or rejuvenated in order to make it fresh and young again. And a key in making this happen many times is what you said, Piata, which is the local dimension. Recently, I came across this example in and around the Venetian lagoon, which is recently under a lot of attention in a European perspective, especially because of the big cruise liners, which are going into the Laguna. With a couple of weeks ago, also a big cruise liner crashing into one of the docks because these things happen. And the Poveglia, which is an area of the Laguna of Venice, is actually for a number of years trying not to keep people out, not to limit tourism, not to stop people from enjoying the mechanism of what an experience of a site like this maritime old historical places, but in a way of trying to make it more real. Are historical reenactments just people in costumes, or are they practicing what they really believe? centuries-old ways of behaving together? Is the food there just for quick tourism money, or is it actually the way people relate to each other? And therefore, maybe even tourists can partake in that experience. But how do you do it? How do you gain the very delicate experience? Because allowing people to enjoy a place in the mass tourism model doesn't seem to be working anymore. Many cities, the latest one earlier this week was Bruges in Belgium, in the Flanders, who said, like Amsterdam, like Venice, like Barcelona, we need to start dropping our numbers because we can't keep up with this. So the tourists are not getting an experience, and we are losing our feeling with the territory. So coming back to your point, yes, the local communities, which also change because they are not made of stone either, they are changed as well. But somehow there needs to remain this relevance of the place with the people.
Very interesting, and it's coming also to my mind something that at first could have nothing to do with what we are discussing, but in my point of view, it has a lot to do. For example, what is going on in Venezuela, which there is a huge discussion on should other countries intervene on what's going on in this place or not, or it's like it's sovereign. They have the people, they have to decide on what's going on. So on tourism, maybe something like this could happen, a situation like this. For example, what you were saying, right, in Yucatan or other places where you can see you are as an expert on tourism, for example, or well, anybody also could see that and think, is this right? Should everybody be touching this World Heritage buildings or not? So I don't know, but I think that sometimes we are too close, right, for from something that we can't have a wider perspective. So that's why I think it's important, the interaction between global groups, leaders, countries, experts, and local people, right? Does it make sense?
Yes. Speaking of the local and international, the Union for Local Governments, UCLG, which promotes the cultural sustainability standards, also issues the Agenda 21, which is regularly revised, focuses very much on this element, sort of how the international community or international practice is there to be learned from, but also challenged. And somehow standards which might apply in different places do not necessarily apply lock, stock, and barrel to individual places. And I don't think it's a matter of sort of north or south or the west and the rest of the world, because as there are many examples around Europe, there are local realities which are trying to redevise and redesign what it means to be a creative city or a cultural city. So there are many local communities that, in a way, have a say, have a stake, and own a place. It's very sad sometimes to see sort of one community trying to own completely, exclusively, against others, the use of a place. We know it can be also dangerous when it comes, for example, into religion or certain political practices. My mind goes to the occupied territories in Palestine or other situations in, for example, the borders between Azerbaijan and Armenia, where heritage sometimes and the people of that heritage are destroyed because it is inconvenient to have certain historical remnants alive, or in terms of heritage, which is tangible, still being annoying or embarrassing through their presence. And therefore, in those cases, it is especially important for international communities, as you mentioned in this case of the example of Venezuela, for example, to take a stand, to discuss the situation, to take a position, to try to influence, maybe to try to act as brokers in a way that can be aiming at the resolution of conflicts in an objective, balanced way. And that maybe is another topic for another time, tourism, culture, and conflict resolution. But in terms of what you're saying, that international perspective, however, has to be checked all the time with all the realities on the ground. Because otherwise there can be sometimes a dangerous detachment between the two levels.
Great. We said about talking about 30 to 35 minutes, something like this. So we are already 30 minutes talking.
Sure.
So just we haven't received any questions for now, but I think you raised an interesting topic for another meeting also. Do you have any other? I was thinking actually, if you could at least show us specifically an experience that, at least for your point of view, because just rewinding a little bit, when you're saying, okay, you're a white European, well, something like this, person, and there is a point of view coming from that background, right, which is different from someone who was born in Africa or someone who was born somewhere else. So from your point of view, or from the point of view of your experience there, could you maybe show us, maybe as also a closing of the talking, an experience that you think it was well built as a good practice, maybe with the participation of the community, or maybe using UNESCO's references, I don't know, something like this, to give us like a parameter.
Yes, I think since we spoke about sort of more culture and heritage till now, maybe we can conclude with a reference to the UNWTO. So again, within a UN perspective, but focusing specifically on tourism, which also focuses very much on numbers. And I think this element of trying to find, as you can see here, a baseline, because at some point, the challenge is going forward, thinking ahead, planning ahead. But as people in the field of research, any research really will tell us, if you are not agreeing on where to start off from, then you've got a problem, because you're not agreeing on your starting point. And in a way, that is where the challenge is, because everyone has different realities. The terrain is very mixed, and therefore it's difficult to find a common starting point. Which, however, shouldn't discourage us from searching ways of doing so. And this has been done. So we're not starting ourselves from zero, because there are a number of documents, a number of research processes and programs over the years that have been doing this. And I think that, in a way, that is the joy of research itself, of education itself, which is making us go back sometimes to the drawing board and trying to relearn certain things, because sometimes we don't know and we need to learn, but sometimes we know, but we need to unlearn what we know. So challenging ourselves, I think, especially in terms of trying to find ways of finding ways forward, sometimes involves going back, trying to find ways of maybe the way things were, how they need to be changed, or how they need to be preserved, and trying in a way to find common languages of communicating with each other. Which brings us back to your point about the international and the local dimension.
Great, thank you. I'll take a better look on that website also. If you can paste the link of this website you entered on the chat, so that others can see.
Yes, there it is.
Later. Okay.
Very good.
If you can insert in the chat on the YouTube. Can you do that?
Good. This is good. I'm putting them here, but I'll also put on.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so we were trying to make this one shorter. That was one of our goals, right? Because we know how things are today. It's hard to have time. And so we wanted to be more direct to the point. So it was great. Thank you again, Karsten, for that. Do you have anything else to add, or should we?
Oh, no. Thank you very much again for the opportunity, and we'll speak again soon.
Okay, great. Okay,
Right.
bye everyone. Thank you.